This program is for critical thinkers. And now, here's your host, integrated media professor, longtime Spokane talk radio personality, and award-winning broadcast veteran, Mike Fitzsimmons.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. We start every program off with a definition as to what critical thinking is all about. And critical thinking is simply this: the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment about that issue. And today we got a couple of themes that are sort of underlying what we're going to talk about today. One is this, spoken apparently by Joseph Stalin at first, and it says, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. And a second theme underlying this program today is lies, damn lies, and statistics. And we also, by the way, happen to have a sponsor today. He is Steve Major. And Steve, we thank you very much for underwriting today's program. All right, let's get started, shall we? As of today, the popular vote in the United States following the election of Tuesday a week ago is over 149 million votes cast. Now, that's an all-time record. It's a huge number of people who have participated in this election, and yet at the same time, and this is an interesting sidelight, it represents approximately 65% of all of the eligible voters who could have cast ballots but did not cast ballots. So about 35% of Americans who are of age to vote and could have registered to vote and could have cast ballots did not participate in this election, notwithstanding the fact that the turnout itself was a record and quite astounding indeed. Let's look at where we are now. We have several states that are holding up the determination of this election. And let's first understand the United States mainstream media, particularly broadcast networks and news stations, do not determine who the next president of the United States will be. I know that they like to think they do, but they absolutely do not determine who the next president of the United States will be. They can project all they want to, but until the votes in the several states are counted and until those votes are certified, we don't know who the president is. And therefore, it's a little premature to be suggesting that Joe Biden is the next president of the United States. He may well be, and indeed betting money would say that he's going to be, but the reality of it is that he hasn't been certified as the winner of any election in any state in this union, and until such time as that happens, he is not the president-elect. I have to laugh at the kind of phony office he created. You notice that the last few times you've seen him on television, he has as a background from the office of the president-elect of the United States, as though there is such an office. There is no such office, but it's trying to look official. And it's part of the overall psychological aspect of this election that is, to a certain extent, a little on the phony side. Let's look at where the reality lies. In Pennsylvania right now, 99% of the vote has been counted. And Biden has a 49.8% to 49% lead over the president. And that lead is, in fact, translated to 53,978 votes. In Arizona, 99% of the vote has been counted. Biden has a 49.4 to 49.1% lead over President Trump. And that amounts to a total of 11,537 votes. That's all. In Georgia, 99% of the vote has been counted. Joe Biden has a 49.5 to 49.2% lead over President Trump at this time. And that amounts to 13,994 votes. In North Carolina, 99% of the vote has been counted. President Trump has a 50.1 to 48.7% lead over Joe Biden, and that amounts to 73,192 votes. And in Alaska, where only 82% of the vote has thus far been counted, President Trump has a 56 to 40.2% lead over Joe Biden at this point, and the margin of votes is 45,098. Now, of that 149 million people who voted, so far 77,242 plus 90 votes have gone to Joe Biden. 77,242,090 votes. And to Trump, 72,096,175. Very, very large turnout, very, very close race, all things considered. This is, of course, not consistent with what we were told was going to happen, is it? If you remember, and I'll go through them for you if you don't, the November 2nd, 2020 final projections from all of the pollsters around the United States as to who would win and what the margins would be didn't come close, didn't come anywhere near close, didn't foresee the strides that were made by the GOP in the House of Representatives, now 218 to 212, or 218, pardon me, to 202. No, make that 204, 218 to 204, 12 seats difference between the majority and the minority now, a pickup dramatically by the Republicans. And they also projected that the Senate would go to the Democrats, and it has not. Right now it's 50 to 48. 2 seats will go to a January runoff in the state of Georgia. Well then, it's not who votes that counts, it's who counts the votes. And that seems to be the issue of contention now that is leading us to a number of court cases that may have to be decided before we even know whether a certification can happen in several states. Let's talk about what's going on with that. Joe Biden has been projected by the media to have won 290 votes, which is 20 votes more than the 270 needed to become the president of the United States. Donald Trump has been projected to have won 217 votes at this point, far short of the 270 necessary to be elected as the president of the United States for a second term. And there is a scenario that we need to take a look at, because there are a lot of folks that are holding out a lot of hope that Donald Trump is going to somehow or other pull this off, sort of like an Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom movie plot. I am skeptical that that's going to happen, and I'll explain to you why. Let's look at the situation with respect to where the vote is and where the vote could be as a result of legality or legal action, litigation. If the lawsuit currently being heard regarding alleged unlawful ballots counted in Pennsylvania should result in disqualification of as many as 127,000 ballots, 127,000 ballots hang in the balance under one form or another of the themes, or if you will, or the arguments being made by the GOP with respect to the vote in Pennsylvania. If they disqualify that number of ballots, or anywhere near that number of ballots, half or more, and keep in mind that as I mentioned to you, Biden's 51,000 vote margin of victory currently in Pennsylvania would virtually evaporate. And it's possible that Trump, if the courts see things his way, and by the way, he did win a portion of the victory that he was looking for in Pennsylvania just a few hours ago, when the Pennsylvania court ruled that the extension of the deadline to count votes that was done by the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, not the Pennsylvania State Legislature, but the Secretary of State, that extension was unlawful, and that she did not have the authority to do that. That just broke just a short while ago. And if that's the case, thousands of votes are not going to be permitted according to the court order. They cannot be permitted. Which votes those are and how many they amount to has yet to be ascertained. There's another aspect, of course, as you know, right before the election, the United States Supreme Court was asked by the Trump campaign to disqualify a number of votes because the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania had advanced the number of days that they could count ballots that came in after 8 o'clock on November the 3rd. They extended it by 3 days. And it had to do with, the excuse was that it was COVID related and that people couldn't necessarily be expected to get everything done in time for it to be there by 8 o'clock on election night and to be counted. That has not yet been ascertained. It's likely to go to the Supreme Court if nothing happens at the lower court levels in Pennsylvania, and that could result in tens of thousands of more ballots. So what I'm telling you is that it's possible that what looks like an insurmountable lead of 53,978 votes in Pennsylvania for Joe Biden could, in fact, evaporate. Could. Whether it does or not, another question. However, if that were to happen, then that would make the count Biden 270 and Trump 242, assuming everything else stays stable. Biden would still win the White House because 270 is the threshold of majority. However, if the razor-tight Arizona count should flip, and it's getting closer and closer to flipping right now as we speak, Trump would wind up the winner of the White House. Biden would lose another electoral vote, 11 electoral votes, and he would fall to 259 total votes. Trump's count would rise to 253, not enough to win. That means that some other things would have to happen. What could they be? Well, the most likely scenario of success, not that I'm suggesting it will come to pass, but the most likely scenario for success for Trump would be that the election in Georgia would turn his way, which is already committed to a full recount, as you know, and that recount is a hand count, which means that what would possibly be recounted and kept by machine count will not necessarily be kept because the defects in the balloting will become apparent when they're eyeballed directly by somebody who is counting them specifically with, by the way, a bipartisan overview from both Democrat and Republican poll watchers who will be looking at that recount, and that recount is about to begin. But let's just, for the sake of discussion, move on and say that the Georgia recount doesn't necessarily turn Trump's way. If Biden maintains his slim lead at the end of that, he would gain 16 electoral votes, and thereby he would secure the White House with a total of 275, 5 more than the necessary 270. If Trump should emerge the winner, then after the recount, he would have 269 electoral votes, and Biden would have 259. The Trump campaign intends to ask for a recount, which any candidate is lawfully allowed to be able to do, in the state of Wisconsin, where he is behind by a margin of approximately 1%. But if that recount cannot take place until Wisconsin's county count, I don't remember how many counties there are in Wisconsin, but all of them will have to report their canvassing results, which by law has to be completed no later than November the 17th, which is this coming Saturday. Is it Saturday? Yeah, Saturday. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then they can't even begin to request a recount until that time. For the sake of discussion, obviously, if President Trump manages to find more than 20,000 ballots unlawfully counted in the state of Wisconsin in Joe Biden's favor, then he could win Wisconsin's 10 electoral votes and secure a second term as president of the United States by a margin of 279 to 259. But what if Wisconsin doesn't yield enough improper ballots to change that number? Unless any other legal action is taken by either Biden or Trump, and if we have a 269, 259 margin, at that point you can be sure that both campaigns will be talking legal action. The race for the White House would be deadlocked, 269 for Trump, 259 for Biden. Then what happens? Well, that would throw the contest into the House of Representatives if they couldn't find any other votes anyplace else, and it looks as though all the rest of the states are pretty well committed. This is an unusual constitutional scenario. Indeed, it hasn't even happened but one time. 1824 was the last time this occurred. And if it goes to the House, The outcome does not turn on which party has the majority of seats in the House of Representatives. Indeed, in a concession to small states concerned that their voices would be marginalized if the House was called upon to choose the President of the United States, way back when the founders gave only one vote to each state. One vote to each state. What does that mean? Well, that means that a state like California, that happens to have 40 million people, would only have one vote. And a state like Wyoming, that only has a population of around 600,000, would only have one vote. They would be equal. Currently, if that were to be the case, this arrangement would favor the Republicans. The GOP dominates currently the delegations from 26 of the states, exactly the number needed for a majority, one more state than the Democrats have at this point. And by the way, that does not count the changes that have been made as a result of the election, and those changes having been projected for certain other members of the House of Representatives who weren't there when the election started, but might be there after January 1st. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, if this election goes to the House of Representatives, it's likely that Trump could win another term. Now, let's be critical thinkers about this. Let's be objective. Let's analyze this and evaluate it. The pathway for re-election for President Trump that I described in this scenario involves, I believe, far too many scenarios that would have to fall perfectly in place for him to win. This is not a Mission Impossible plot. It's not an Indiana Jones plot. It's not about a movie. I think the realist, I think the critical thinker looking at this has to concede that Donald Trump is not going to serve a second term. And that being the case, the rest of us who wanted him to, myself included, going to have to just learn how to live with that. When we come back, we're going to talk about what factors led to the loss of the White House by President Trump. And it really wasn't the popularity and enthusiasm for Joe Biden, because there was almost none of that. We'll be back in a minute. Stay with us.
We believe every person is created in the image of God with immeasurable beauty and worth, that people should not be defined by their present condition or past mistakes. We are all broken. We need each other. Healing for our brokenness begins with connection, with understanding how much we are loved by a good God. And with healing comes change, the potential for joy and meaning. No one was created for mere survival on the streets, for an existence blurred by mind-numbing substances. Each person is created with a purpose, a unique gift no one else can offer the world. Our job is to help them rediscover it. Real people, real change. Union Gospel Mission.
Welcome back to For Critical Thinkers. Let's take a look at the factors that contributed to the success that Joe Biden appears to be having with respect to the election of 2020. There are several factors. Number one is the press. Number two is the press. Number three is the press. Number four is social media. I mean, let's be realistic about something. A guy who held up in his basement 51% of the time between the last debate in the Democratic effort to find a nominee for president and election night 2020, who did not particularly inspire anybody on the Democratic side, who couldn't hold a rally with more than about 100 people, if he could even get that many. Most of the time there were 25 or 30 cars, and most of those belonged to the media that was covering his rallies. This guy didn't exactly turn the nation on its ear. He didn't exactly set the hearts and minds of Americans on fire. So how the devil did he win? We're going to talk about possible voter fraud and what have you shortly, but let's take a look at what he did have going for him prior to the election. Let us begin with what the polling numbers said on Monday, November the 2nd, the day before the election this year. All 6 of the swing states, according to the polls, had Biden winning. All of them. Now, that's clearly not what happened, because we have some swing states in play as we speak now, almost a week and a couple of days after the election. All 6 swing states, Biden 50%, Trump 46%. That was the aggregate. In Arizona, Biden was picked by the pollsters to beat Trump 50-47. It's so close in Arizona right now that it's not possible to have come to that conclusion reasonably, and it may be wrong altogether before it's over. In Florida, Biden was picked to win 51% to 48%. We all know that before election night was over, Florida was already decided for Trump, clearly a victory for the president. In Michigan, Biden had a 51-44% lead over Trump. It's nowhere near that much of a lead as we speak, and there are legal issues in Michigan that could reduce that lead even more, and on a long shot, perhaps, overturn it. In North Carolina, Biden was projected to have a 49-47 win over Trump, and Trump has led since election night without fail by 2 percentage points over Biden in that state. In Pennsylvania, Biden had a 50-46% projected win, and that one is at this time awfully close as well, as I mentioned to you. And given the legal activity that is underway now, that could either evaporate altogether or be even closer by far than they projected. And in Wisconsin, Biden was projected to win 53% to Trump's 45%. And he barely leads in the state of Wisconsin as we speak at this point as well. So they got it wrong again. They got it wrong in 2016. They got it wrong again. The NBC News national polling average had Biden up more than 7 percentage points over Trump, 51-44 in the election as was projected the day before the actual election itself and the final polling, pre-election polling. Quinnipiac had Biden up, are you ready? 17 percentage points. Several polls had him up 11 percentage points over Trump. The spread was based on unweighted averages of the 10 most recent reliable public opinion polls on that date, all of which proved to be not reliable at all. The Real Clear Politics general election polling average on the day before the election showed Biden with a 6.5 point lead over Trump, which had slipped just a little bit from 7.8% that it had showed in Biden's favor just 7 days earlier. The Real Clear Politics average of polls in 6 key battleground states, Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona, had Biden leading by 2.7 at the minimum, 2.7 percentage points. And Trump won all of those states in 2016, as you recall. The 538, folks, the national polling from that tracker gave Biden an 8.4% advantage on election day, 1 point below where he stood a week prior. Its models maintain that Biden was favored to win the entire election, hands down. It was considered to be probably a 325 or higher electoral vote count for Biden. And despite the slightly tightening averages of national polls, Biden was still well ahead of where the then nominee Hillary Clinton stood against Trump in the final days of the election of 2016. And the question is this: how did they get it so wrong again? Was it that they were incompetent, that they didn't know what they were doing, that their data was crazy, that people weren't telling them the truth, or that people weren't responding to them? What was it? What it was a deliberate effort to discourage Republican voting, and it blew up in their face. The question is, do pre-election polls have excuse me, do pre-election polls have an appreciable effect on voters? Do they? Think about that. Do they have the ability to suppress voter turnout and or voter decisions? I mean, if the polls say that your favorite candidate is going to lose and you're on your way to vote today, and he's going to lose, or she is, especially by a significant margin, does that do anything at all to discourage you from voting? And the answer is it does. And if cleverly and carefully crafted, it can affect thousands, hundreds of thousands of voters. And it did. That's one of the takeaways from this election that we need to ponder very carefully. Because the press basically served as Biden's public relations managers for the entire campaign. I mean, when you're holed up in your basement, and whenever you come out and have things to say on your own, you wind up tripping over your own lower lip. And when you can't remember things and you pause in the middle of your sentences and can't recall what you were talking about, and we saw all of this, if the press doesn't report that or underplays that or whatever, a lot of folks who are thinking about the possibility they might want to vote other than Democrat aren't going to see that and won't get their concerns about the Democratic candidate. They won't get those verified in any way, shape, or form. There was a definite cover-up going on there, as you know. The legal battles now, assuming that I'm right about the probability that Trump isn't going to win as a result of what's going on with respect to these vote counts, not going to be able to turn them. There's a reason why he's not going to be able to turn them, and I want to talk about some of the legal strategies that are being undertaken by the Trump campaign so that we can get a sense of just exactly what it is he's trying to do and how possible the success of those legal strategies might be. In Pennsylvania, the Trump campaign is arguing that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's order to extend the vote count for 3 days after 8 p.m. on November the 3rd, the deadline, codified in state law as passed by the legislature, was unconstitutional. The court decision usurped the intent of Pennsylvania's Republican-held legislature, which is tasked with the responsibility of setting the rules of the election, and it did set the rules of the election. Trump wants all ballots that arrived after 8 o'clock on November the 3rd to be thrown out. If he is able to succeed in that, he could win Pennsylvania, as I mentioned. But is he able to succeed? This is where I doubt it. Some maybe, all probably not. And even if he gets some, how much of the total ballots will there be that get tossed in the end? Trump wants all of them thrown out. Pennsylvania's election commissioner, Al Schmidt, says that roughly 1,000 mail-in ballots arrived during the 3-day window after the 3rd of November. 1,000, as you know, wouldn't cut it. GOP monitors, the Trump folks are claiming, were not permitted to be close enough to the counting of the votes in Philadelphia and other counties to meaningfully observe whether or not any suspect ballots were added to the county's final tally. And we know that's an important point. And we know that actually happened. We know that they literally papered the windows looking into the counting area to keep folks from outside to be able to see what was going on. And when a court told them they had to take the paper down and let those folks in, the Pennsylvania election officials defied the court order and still didn't do that for another 24 hours. And when they brought them in, they allowed them to be between 30 and 100 feet of the actual election workers. So they couldn't see anything on the ballots, and it was virtually a wasted process because there was no way in which they could tell whether or not ballots that should have been disqualified were being allowed or otherwise. There are 2 cases currently active regarding the monitor access and the counting of votes in the Philadelphia area and in the Pittsburgh area. And the city has appealed the earlier Commonwealth Court order to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which agreed this week to take up the case. And so we're not sure exactly where that goes. We did tell you that the court did favor Trump's position with respect to another extension that existed as a result of the order of the Pennsylvania elections supervisor with respect to ballots that came in after election night as well, but that's a separate set of ballots. The third area that they are looking at trying to recover some of the ballots that they're down by at this point has to do with dead people voting. And we know that several dozen convincing, clear, cogent, and convincing affidavits have been filed proving that persons who were deceased indeed cast ballots. Submitted as a part of the documentation for that particular complaint are the photographs of these individuals, the dates of their birth and death, the obituaries for these individuals, and a copy of the ballot jacket that was submitted that has the date in which it was submitted and the postmark if there was one, or the affidavit contains the statement from the polling place that says that person came and voted at a particular time, and we checked in their ballot at that time. Dead people voting in several states is an issue, as you probably know. Now let's assume that all of this is provable. It is, I think, and it will be proven. How many ballots will be disqualified? That's the question. And if the answer is not enough to change the outcome of the election in Pennsylvania, then the exercise comes to an end without success. And I think that's what's going to happen. They're going to find a lot of them. Is there voter fraud? I know that the mainstream press keeps telling us, oh, there's no voter fraud, there's no voter fraud. What I just told you is prima facie evidence and empirical proof of voter fraud. Dead people can't vote. Dead people can't vote, and if indeed a ballot is turned in their name, somebody broke the law. Now that's voter fraud. There is voter fraud. The question is, how widespread is it, and whether or not it can overturn particular vote counts in counties and states, as it were. Let's look at Arizona. Trump's campaign is alleging that the Arizona state's populous county, Maricopa County, incorrectly rejected votes cast on election day by some voters. The lawsuit claims that poll workers in Maricopa County told some voters to press a button after a machine had detected a overvote and directed them to make a correction. The campaign says that decision basically disregarded voters' choices in those races. The lawsuit suggested that those votes could prove determinative in the outcome of the presidential race in Pennsylvania. And then there's the so-called Sharpies claim, as you know, and it's not just in Pennsylvania, not just in Arizona, but also in Wisconsin and Michigan and other locations where Sharpies, which are ink pens, as you know, permanent markers, were used to mark the voters' preferences on ballots, and they bled through to the other side of the ballot, leaving the machine confused as to what it is the voter actually wanted, and so the machine would then kick out the ballot as an invalid ballot. Again, the question doesn't come down to whether or not that happened or whether or not it happened to a lot of hundreds or even 1,000 or two folks in any given state. It's whether or not the event itself resulted in a number of ballots disqualified that would have made Trump the winner in that state versus Biden the winner in that state. And again, I'm afraid that doesn't typically happen. The experience for errors as well as for deliberate omissions in voting has been that a few hundred votes at the most are affected by the process, but not tens of thousands. And that's likely to be the case this time as well. Move to Georgia now. The Trump campaign alleges there that late arriving ballots were improperly mingled with valid ballots. The late arriving ballots were not supposed to be counted. and the Trump administration Trump campaign rather, has asked a judge to order leader writing ballots to be separated and not counted. Well, that case, unfortunately, was dismissed today, so that's going nowhere. And you've heard other claims. Out-of-state persons illegally casting ballots in Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona. Dead people voting in a number of other states. Several large Democratic counties, Wayne County in Michigan, where Detroit is located. Philadelphia County in Pennsylvania, erecting barriers to keep lawful poll watchers from being able to observe the count. Even defying the court order in Pennsylvania, for example, in Philadelphia, to permit the poll monitors to have access. They refused to obey the judge's clear order. Election officials are said to have illegally helped voters cure their ballots. That is to say, where there were errors, a failure at signature, for example, or information that was incorrect, or something that was crossed out that was supposed to have been replaced by a new ballot, that the election workers helped these people do these, and that was something that in these various states they weren't supposed to do, but there are numerous affidavits, sworn affidavits from individuals who say they saw it happen and that it happened to them. Unlawful ballot harvesting taking place in several states as well. And you know that the several states that we're talking about have, some of them have laws saying that you cannot harvest ballots, but that it was done. And we know that it having been done would have been illegal. And we know who, generally speaking, the loser was when that sort of thing happened. So all of these things amount to the complaints that are being filed in a variety of different lawsuits, some of them collective, that is to say all issues under the same suit, and some of them individual in individual counties, and some of them statewide, etc. It's a lot of legal work. It's a lot of paper. It's a lot of interviewing of individuals who are in a position to be able to explain to the court that they are eyewitnesses to violations. And I think that the Trump campaign is going to be able to prove almost all of these claims. The problem is that it will be almost impossible in some cases to determine how many ballots were tainted and thus should be disqualified or invalidated as a result of that. And in other cases, it's only going to be a handful of ballots that were affected in the first place, not enough to turn the margins between Biden and Trump. In other words, in the end, Trump will fail in a legal effort to try to win the election. And that's unfortunate for those of us who think that he would have been the better president without a doubt, but that's the way it works. And that's likely to be the outcome. That's likely to be what's going to occur here. Now then, the role of the press in all of this. I think the biggest takeaway from this election is that we have a out of control fourth estate, the press. And we have an out of control social media. The platforms are now becoming the censors of free speech in America. And that is terribly, terribly dangerous. And the last of the takeaways from this election has to do with the completion of the Senate races, two of which in Georgia involve Republicans who, if they are, at least one of them is elected again in a special runoff in January, that will cement a majority for the Republicans in the Senate. And if both of them are lost, there would be a tie in the Senate. And that would mean the vice president, who under the Constitution is the president of the Senate, that would be Kamala Harris, if Joe Biden succeeds, which I believe he will. She'll make the decision in tie-breaking cases, and the Democrats can run amok with their far-left agenda if that becomes the case. So we'll focus on that when we return. You're watching For Critical Thinkers. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons, and we'll be right back. Stay with us.
here at River Ridge Hardware, we can match any color for you. So you need this color matched for your trim in your bathroom, come to the color computer, stick it into the spectrometer, and allow the machine to do its thing, and it will match your trim exactly. So whether it was done by water damage or a young child, we can get you covered and get it matched. If you do need to have something so that it completely disappears, I can certainly help you with that one as well. Along with the spectrometer color matching capability that can match any competitor's paint color, we have a beautiful color palette that can help you start any new project. Give us a try.
Welcome back to For Critical Thinkers. The last pieces that we need to look at with respect to this election as we critically analyze it has to do with the press largely, and also with the what steps come next question. The fully biased anti-Trump media went beyond anything that the Fourth Estate in the history of this country a threshold ever was crossed in the past. We've always known that the press is biased. We've always known that it applies a double standard for Republicans versus Democrats. We've always known that they're lenient with respect to Democrat errors or mistakes or misstatements or whatever, and that they're brutal to any one Republican. But this went even far beyond that. In fact, the media became Joe Biden's entire campaign this time. Biden's in the basement, but the media was carrying the water for him. Historians will look back at this election and say the power of the press was so incredibly encroaching on the free decision-making of the American people in this election that it's almost worth revisiting the First Amendment and determining about whether or not Congress should make some laws regarding the freedom of the press. Deliberately presented a false picture of reality. You know they did. And they did for 4 years, not just the last several months. The press has been complicit in a number of conspiracies to destroy the Trump presidency from the day he came down the escalator before he was ever nominated or elected to this very day. They created a false picture of reality. Pew Research, which is a center-left research organization, puts out a report known as the Excellence in Journalism Report. And they indicated that in the months leading up to the election of 2020, that the mainstream press, the main television networks, news networks, as well as the major publications, newspapers, and magazines, published 92% negative stories about Donald Trump. Anything and every single thing he did was reported in the negative. We also know that they covered up Joe Biden's very real cognitive problems, something which, by the way, we're all going to discover, including those folks who elected him, because they're going to wonder when they see some of his performances, what the heck's the matter with this guy? I didn't know he had problems. I didn't know he was having cognitive difficulty. They covered it up deliberately, or made excuses, or somehow or other managed to gloss over what was actually happening. They padded phony polling data for months. This is not mistakes that were made based on the sampling that they were doing. This was a deliberate effort to suppress vote, particularly vote on the right. They ignored and suppressed the Hunter Biden scandal, which isn't over yet. And particularly if the Senate remains in Republican hands, that issue is going to come before a public that in many cases doesn't even know the story existed, because so many of the major networks and major publications deliberately refused to report it. They ignored and suppressed the Hunter Biden scandal, but it isn't over yet. They maintained a constant negative barrage against Trump, underreporting his accomplishments. This guy got 4 independent nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize in connection with the work he was doing to bring peace to the Middle East and the work between Arab and Israel and the Israelis, and now has several countries lined up to sign along with the 2 that are already involved in making peace with Israel. And if that had been a Democratic president, that would have been front page news, the likes of which would have resulted in the singing of the praises for weeks and weeks on end. But no, not in this case. A rapid economic recovery, what the president called a super V or a V, and we have seen that. The stock market this week traded in the record territory it left before COVID. And that wasn't because of Joe Biden doing anything. His policy, none of his policies have been attempted. However, market experts are saying that if indeed he does what he's going to do with his taxes and what have you, the market will fall 4,000 or 5,000 points, which is going to mean that if you are dealing with a 401k that's in pretty good shape right now, be prepared to see it start to flounder. Underreporting accomplishments, over-reporting mistakes, deliberately. Anything that Trump said that was a misstatement got more play than it was worth, but the whole idea was make the voters think Trump shouldn't get a second term. And more important even than that, make the Republican voters believe that Trump is just simply losing and it's not going to work out in our favor. Substantial progress against COVID-19. Did you notice that the announcement of the vaccine did not take place until after the election, although it could have taken place before the election, because 10 days before the election, Pfizer knew exactly what it had there. And they sat on that. And who did they tell first? Did they tell the president? No. They didn't tell the administration. On the night before the president and the administration learned about this, they contacted Joe Biden to let him know first. And why? Why would they do that? Well, it might be because President Trump was in the process of getting favored nation status for persons who were paying for prescription drugs here in the United States at prices exorbitant compared to what they were being purchased for by citizens of other countries. And most of the R&D was paid for by Americans and American consumers. And we were getting the highest price for the drugs, giving it away in Canada, Mexico, Europe, Asia, and charging us through the nose for it. And that meant profits would fall a bit on a number of pharmaceuticals, and Big Pharma didn't like that. So they stuck it between the shoulder blades for the president on that particular one. And now you watch. When Trump was saying there was going to be a vaccine, the mainstream media said, you can't trust it. It's Trump. It's sped up too fast. They're cutting corners. They're screwing it up. They're doing, even though Trump himself had absolutely nothing to do with the preparation of the vaccine, nothing whatsoever to do with it. That was being done by private enterprise in concert with and funded by, in part by, the federal government. But now, you watch. This is going to be called the Biden vaccine. Biden's going to take the credit for this. Now, that's just the way the ball bounces in politics, and I'm not suggesting that if the situation were reversed, that the Republicans wouldn't try to take advantage of that situation. They probably would. But you can just see that it's all part of a mosaic to discredit the president and to build up a candidate who never ever looked the American people in the eye once in the process, didn't hold press conferences, was never asked questions more complicated than what flavor is the ice cream cone you just bought. Anyway, you get the picture. We've got a runaway press, and if they'll lie over the 4 years of the Trump administration, then they're going to lie in favor of the Biden administration. Either way, you're the loser. Either way, the consumer of news and information is going to be taken for a ride by this press unless something is done. And then we have the issue of the Section 230 Communications Decency Act of 1996 involving Twitter, Google, Facebook, and others. These platforms received very special consideration in 1996 in conjunction with the Telecommunication Act of that year. Fearing repeal of Section 230, social media engaged in, and as we speak continues to engage in, a campaign of biased censorship. Not that they want the truth to be out there about anything, they just want their own butts covered. They want to protect themselves and their interests first. That which is truthful for America first has to be good for the social media platforms. And we're talking about billionaires from Silicon Valley. 47 U.S. Code at Section 230, which is a provision of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. Section 230 says that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or the speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. In other words, they are simply a conduit passing through the information to you. Not deciding what gets posted on the platform, but just presenting it. And since if they were, in fact, the author of that, they would be suable. You could bring a lawsuit against them, litigation against them for libel, slander, whatever the case, defamation of character, etc. But that is as long as they were not serving as a publisher, simply as a provider of information, a conduit, if you will, a platform. Well, they are now a publisher. When they decide you cannot say something on their platform, they are determining what can and cannot be said on their platform. And they can do that for any reason, socioeconomic, political, whatever the case happens to be. Having crossed over that threshold, they are no longer the entities that Section 230 gave them the privilege to be. And scared to death that if the Republicans won the White House and the Senate again, and if they could gain seats in the House, Section 230 might be up for repeal quickly. These folks made a calculated decision to essentially steer the outcome of the election by what they allowed through and what they held back. They became the gatekeepers. Information that favored their interests got through. Information that threatened or in some way may have called, even in a remote sort of way, their intentions into question did not get through. Censorship. What the press did, how they acted in this election, what the social media platforms are doing as a result of this election and will continue to do now. They're already sucking up to the Biden folks. They want a seat at the table there. All of that works to your detriment. All of it does. Whether you voted for Biden or you didn't vote for Biden, notwithstanding, the bottom line is you had better take a serious look at this whole situation, because you may not know it, but you're in trouble. You're in big trouble. How many of your friends have told you, I was going to pass this piece of information on to you, but Twitter or Google or Facebook would not allow me to do it? When they start censoring your free speech, you got to realize something very, very bad is happening. And if you ignore it, you will live one day to deeply regret it. That's one of the key takeaways of this particular election. Another thing to point out, I think it's dawning on most Americans now that the odds are greatly against Donald Trump succeeding in challenging the election results such that he will see a second term. But I don't see any people on the right setting police cars on fire, destroying businesses, raising hell in the streets. Not one. Not one. And yet the press keeps saying, well, they might not accept the outcome. Trump may lock himself in the White House and we'll have to get the army to get him out. Give me a break. I mean, give me a break. The bottom line is, if Trump does not see a rational pathway to a re-election and to a second term, he will peacefully hand over the reins of power. He loves his country, for crying out loud. He isn't going to do that. It's not going to occur that way. That's completely a fabrication of the left-wing press. That's all that is. Does he have the right to challenge these things and try to clarify what actually happened in the election and have fixed some of the wrongs that occurred as a result of the election practices in some states and counties? Absolutely he does. The very left that says he should give it up, he should concede, gave Al Gore 37 days in one state alone to try to make his case. And they never criticized him for a second. But look what they're doing here. And so it goes. The election is just about over. And it appears as though Joe Biden is going to be the president of the United States for 4 years, if he can last that long, less than that if he can't. Who knows what fate awaits us in this particular situation. But one last point. If the Senate stays in Republican hands, most of the far left crazy lunatic agenda of the Democrats will not come to pass. No court packing, no statehood for Puerto Rico or Washington, D.C., resulting in 2 senators from each of those locations, perpetually Democratic. No Green New Deal, none of that. And given the momentum that has occurred in the House of Representatives with respect to seats picked up by the Republicans that nobody believed was possible, 2 years from now they can complete the job and the Congress will be in the hands of Republicans. And 4 years from now, after we realize what a screw up we made in the 2020 election, a Republican will once again serve in the White House. Think about that. Don't give up the faith, but also don't ignore what's happening. Keep your eyes open. The critical thinker will do that. The rest will go back to whatever they were doing before they crawled out of their hole to vote Democratic because they're members of the tribe. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons. This is For Critical Thinking. I'll be back again next Thursday, and we'll look in on you at that time. Thank you very much for watching.